ISIS has and continues to demolish and bomb our churches, cultural artifacts, and sacred places like Mar Bihnam and his sister, a 4th century monastery, and St. George Monastery in Mosul. Uprooted and forcefully displaced, we have realized that ISIS plans to evacuate the land of Christians and wipe the earth clean of any evidence that we ever existed.
That was Dominican sister Diana Momeka of Iraq, testifying before Congress this week at a hearing on ISIS's persecution of religious minorities. To discuss this, I'm joined on set by the chairman of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs who chaired that hearing, Congressman Ed Royce. Welcome to the program,
Raymond. It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to have you here. We keep reading and hearing sisters' testimony, and I know you had several people testify this week. More than 100,000 refugees, cultural and church institutions sacked and destroyed utterly. Art, irreplaceable human touchstones are just obliterated. Even now, ISIS beheaded 10 more people today, and they're moving in on another Syrian cultural artifact. What should we do here? There's certainly not an appetite to send troops in.
No, there is not. But there are steps that certainly we can take. For example, there's a 600-mile front in which Kurdish forces, 30% of those battalions, are made up of young women. And they're fighting with small arms. They're fighting against ISIS. Now, ISIS, since they captured the central bank at Mosul, is the terrorist group with the most in terms of financial resources of any on the planet, and they've taken a lot of weapons, artillery, and so forth. We in the United States should be assisting the Kurds in giving them the weapons they need, because behind their lines, they're protecting Chaldeans, Syrian Christians as well, protecting Yazidis. As if you remember on Mount Sinjar, where the Yazidis were being massacred, they came to their rescue. We can use air power to assist in this, and we should. And secondarily, we should be giving the Kurds the artillery, the long-range mortars, the anti-tank missiles they need.
And why aren't we, Jim?
Well, Iran puts a lot of pressure on Baghdad not to allow the Kurdish region or indeed the Sunni regions to have any support, because there's a lot of support for the Shia militia.
Right.
And the consequence of that is that the Kurds, which are the one organized institution up there that are defending minority rights and Christian rights, are not getting the support they need.
Let's shift slightly here. Our Secretary of Defense is now in Russia. He just met with Secretary of State, rather, is in Russia, meeting with Putin. And it appears the Russians are still supporting Assad, and the United States wants to remove them from that support. Why? Wouldn't that empower ISIS and these rebel groups in Syria if you dislocate support for Assad?
It's a complicated problem, but let me explain what's happening with ISIS right now, for example. If you go into northern Syria, there are Christian brigades that are fighting in Aleppo against ISIS. Women in some of these brigades. There are Alawite and Sunni units, and this is basically the Syrian middle class. So as they're fighting ISIS on the ground, they're dealing with the barrel bombs that are being dropped, and it's to stop these barrel bombs from the sky from being dropped on civilian targets that we're trying to engage in a strategy that puts an end also to the use of chemical weapons, because that only accelerates the mayhem and the crisis. Now, just out of Mosul, we talked about Mosul, before. 2 million refugees have fled that area when ISIS took that over, and you also have several million refugees fleeing from this portion of Syria. And in the wake of that, that is where Christians are being pushed out of their historical homelands. What we need to do is to support those units and those groups like the Kurds that will protect the areas. And secondarily, we have to make certain that when this is done and ISIS is defeated, that the reconstruction can come in so that people can come back to their ancestral lands, so that the Christians there can thrive, so that the Syrian and Chaldean, the Catholic Christians in the area can have a future where they do not vacate that. This is very important.
Yeah.
What ISIS is trying to do is destroy all evidence that is not Mohammedan, and that has to be part of our strategy.
And as Sister Diana testified, these are the original people in this territory.
These
are the original people in this land. It was a Christian land.
That's right.
And to lose that heritage is just, it's a loss not only for them, for all of Christianity and for humanity as a whole. Let's talk for a moment about the special envoy for religious minorities that Congress has requested.
Right.
Where is it? This was to be an envoy, to be the voice here in Congress and around the world for religious minorities in the Middle East, in South Asia. Where
and this is why the concern on the part of myself as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. This is one of the reasons I held this committee hearing in order to bring witnesses from that area, Christians from that area. We heard from not just Chaldeans, and we also heard from Coptic Christians about the circumstances here. We need to be engaged in the United States on behalf of religious liberty, on behalf of these religious minorities, and we need that voice. And we're going to continue with our committee to do more, because it is the most defenseless that are being slaughtered.
So are you waiting on the administration to appoint that ambassador?
We are pushing the administration to get engaged in this issue now.
Let's talk for a moment about the Secretary Kerry meeting with the Russians. There is some tension over the Russians selling missiles to the Iranians and providing them with a missile defense system, a very advanced one. This is a problem when we're trying to contain Iran over here and solidify a nuke deal, isn't it?
And the administration is arguing that this is not really in violation of the sanctions for Russia to do this, but in point of fact it is. And it should bring down enormous additional sanctions on top of Russia for doing it, in order to send the signal that we're not going to look the other way. Because, of course, it encourages an undermining of the agreement that we're trying to form with Iran. And frankly, we're having a hard enough time right now with the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, who continually backs off of what the administration is pushing as a negotiation, and then the administration accepts the Ayatollah's conclusion. We need to stiffen the resolve of the administration in this negotiation.
Now, Congress this week passed a bill that allows you to review that Iranian nuke deal. Is that sufficient?
We feel that that is important and helpful. And let me share with you that last session of Congress, I brought legislation, bipartisan legislation, to the floor, which the administration opposed, which would put additional sanctions on Iran. It passed by 400 to 20, all right? The administration was able to block it at the time in the Senate. This bill, which I brought up today on the House floor, passed by 400 to 25. And the reason we're again getting involved, and I wrote a letter to the president on this subject, we had 367 signers to that letter. Most of the Democrats and virtually all of the Republicans saying, Mr. President, there are 4 issues that have to be addressed here. We have to have verification on the military bases. We have to have our international inspectors have the ability to go in and inspect anywhere,
These
anytime.
nuclear sites, yeah.
And we should not have a signing bonus up front where we release all the sanctions, most of the sanctions up front. This has to be done as we verify over the length of the agreement. It should be 20 years, not 10. These are all things we're pushing for in the negotiation.
Before we leave the Middle East, I have to ask you this question, and it has bubbled up throughout the media landscape, and all the presidential candidates are wrestling with it. And it was the question asked of Jeb Bush the other day. If you knew what you knew now, would you have voted to support the entry of troops into Iraq? Was that the right move, given what we know now?
The vote we cast was the vote to authorize the president, authorize him to give him that authority. Now, I will tell you the argument that Colin Powell made at the time. You know, our Secretary of State said, if we have this ability, then we can go to Saddam Hussein and we can say, allow our inspectors in, cease and desist. We now have this authority. In retrospect, we should have put additional conditions on that authority. Yeah, on that authority.
Interesting. What is your reaction to the Pope's supposed recognition, and I say supposed because I'm not quite certain that it is as profound as some are suggesting, of the State of Palestine, because the Vatican has traditionally supported the State of Palestine and under Benedict's reign referred to it as such. But your reaction to
Well, most Americans, I think, want to see a two-state solution. The question, though, is how we get there. And that becomes quite complicated because we're dealing in a situation where it's not just the Palestinian Authority, it's also Hamas. And if you recall, Hamas got control of Gaza, and then we see what the Gaza war and all of this. This needs to be done in a way in which Israel and the Palestinian Authority are at the table, and I would argue Hamas not at the table because they can't really be trusted, and they negotiate out a framework. Yes, we want to end up with two states, but again, it's how you get there and how you do it in a way where an unfortunate byproduct is not that you end up with Hamas controlling the Palestinian state.
As you know, the Obama administration has softened its relationship with Cuba. We are now opening diplomatic posts and restoring relations. As a part of that, they are crying for the lifting of the Cuban embargo. The Pope is also joining that cry. A good idea or no?
Well, here's the condition, Raymond, that we put when we basically began to engage with Vietnam. We said, we've noticed that you're not allowing companies to pay your workers directly. Well, this is what Cuba is doing. A European company will pay workers. They think they're paying the workers, but they give the check to the Cuban government. 5% of that payment. You pay in euros, the worker gets 5 pesos. Okay, so the result is he gets 5% of his wages. I would say this: yes, we will lift the embargo on the condition you empower your workers, on the condition that when the company comes in to employ, they don't get 5% of the fruits of their labor, to quote Abraham Lincoln, they get 100%.
Yeah, and there's the issues of human and religious rights there that are abysmal. They were listed last week on the, as a country of concern until we lifted it.
Precisely. We can negotiate that out. We've done that in the past with respect to Vietnam. We need to do it here. And by the way, we need to continue to keep the pressure up. One of the arguments I made today on a subject dealing with Vietnam is that we are supposed to hold Vietnam to that same standard. I've met with the representatives of the Catholic community from Vietnam, and this is an area where you can't allow backsliding.
So you would not support any lifting of this embargo unless these conditions, including human rights and religion, were tied to
I would pass something that would say we're lifting the embargo and here's the condition. And I think they would have to accept that condition. But we shouldn't just do it unilaterally without trying to help the workers and empower them in Cuba.
And the people there.
Yes.
Congressman Ed Royce, thank you very so much for being here, for your candor, and for taking the time.